You wake up on a random Tuesday morning. Your alarm goes off. You reach for your phone. Maybe you check your bank account. Maybe you don't, because you already know roughly what's in there. Your paycheck hit a few days ago. Rent is scheduled. A credit card payment is pending. Groceries somehow cost more than they did last month. Gas isn't cheap either. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there's that quiet thought most people don't say out loud. I'm working. I'm paying taxes. I'm doing everything right. So why does it feel like the system keeps taking more from me than from the people who already have the most? Then you see headlines about billionaires, people whose wealth grows by billions in a single year, yet somehow their tax bills often look surprisingly small. And that's when the confusion starts. Because most of us grow up believing something simple. The more money you make, the more taxes you pay. But once you look closely at how wealth actually works, you realize something important. The richest people in the world often aren't playing the same financial game the rest of us are. And one of the clearest examples of that difference is a strategy quietly known as buy, borrow, die. Now, when people first hear that phrase, it sounds dramatic, almost cynical. But in reality, it's not some secret loophole hidden in the shadows. It's simply the natural outcome of how our financial system is built. And understanding it doesn't just explain how the wealthy reduce taxes. It reveals something much deeper about the difference between income and wealth. Because here's the misunderstanding most people carry around. We think taxes are based on how rich someone is. But taxes, in most cases, are based on income, the paycheck, the salary, the money that shows up in your account after a week or two of work. And if you're like most people watching this, your financial life revolves around income. You work, you get paid. A portion goes to taxes, another portion goes to rent or a mortgage. Then food, utilities, insurance, gas, life. And whatever remains, if anything remains, becomes savings. That's the system most people operate inside. But the wealthy often structure their finances in a completely different way. Instead of relying on income, they rely on assets, things that grow in value over time, stocks, businesses, real estate, ownership. And this is where the story starts to shift, because assets can make you wealthier without technically creating taxable income. Imagine someone owns a large amount of stock in a company they founded. Over time, the company grows, the stock price rises. On paper, their wealth might increase by hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's the key detail. They haven't actually sold the stock. And in most tax systems, including in the United States, taxes on investments usually happen when you sell the asset and realize the gain. Until then, it's considered unrealized, meaning the wealth exists, but it hasn't been converted into income yet. So that person might be dramatically richer on paper while technically reporting very little income. And that's the first step in what people call buy, borrow, die. The buy part is straightforward. Acquire assets. Not just things that hold value, but things that tend to grow over time. Businesses, equity, property, investments. Assets that quietly expand while the owner does very little. For most people, the primary financial goal is earning more income. For the wealthy, the goal is owning more assets, and that difference alone changes everything. But the next step is where things become especially interesting. Borrow. Because if your wealth is tied up in assets that you don't want to sell, how do you actually live? How do you pay for houses, travel, lifestyle, everyday expenses? This is where borrowing enters the picture. Let's say someone owns $100 million worth of stock. Selling that stock would trigger taxes on the gains, but instead, they can take a loan using those shares as collateral. Banks are usually very comfortable lending to extremely wealthy people because their assets are so large and stable. So instead of selling investments and paying capital gains taxes, they borrow against them. And here's the fascinating part. Loans aren't considered income. If you borrow money, the government doesn't tax that as earnings. It's debt, not income.
So someone could borrow millions of dollars against their assets, use that money to fund their lifestyle, and still report relatively little taxable income. Meanwhile, their investments may continue growing in the background, sometimes faster than the interest on the loan, which means their overall wealth keeps expanding even while they're borrowing. From a psychological standpoint, this is almost the opposite of how most people interact with debt. For the average household, debt often feels heavy. Credit cards, car payments, student loans. Debt is usually attached to consumption, things that lose value. But in the world of large-scale wealth, debt can be used strategically, not as a burden, but as a tool, a way to access money without triggering taxes. And then comes the final piece of the phrase, die, which sounds a little blunt, but it refers to something very specific in tax law. When someone passes away, their assets often receive what's called a step-up in cost basis. In simple terms, the tax system resets the value of the asset to its current market price at the time of inheritance. So if someone originally bought shares for $1 million, and those shares are worth $50 million when they pass away, the heirs typically inherit them with that new $50 million valuation, meaning the huge gain that happened during the original owner's lifetime may never be taxed in the same way it would have been if the assets were sold earlier. The heirs could sell the asset near that new value with little or no capital gains tax on the historical increase. That's the full cycle people refer to when they say buy, borrow, die. Buy assets, borrow against them instead of selling, and eventually pass them on with a reset tax basis. Now, it's important to pause here for a second, because hearing this for the first time can trigger a few different reactions. Some people feel frustrated, others feel curious. Some feel like the system must be unfair. But the deeper reality is that this strategy isn't really about clever tricks. It's about how the financial system treats income differently from ownership. Income is taxed regularly. Ownership grows quietly in the background, and that difference has enormous consequences over time. Think about the typical financial path most people follow. You work for 30 or 40 years. Your earnings are taxed along the way. If you invest, you might pay taxes when you sell those investments. Your financial life is built around cash flow. But wealth at the highest levels is often built around patience, holding assets, letting them grow, avoiding unnecessary sales, using the value of those assets rather than liquidating them. And when you zoom out, something interesting appears. The strategy itself isn't exclusive to billionaires. The scale is. Most people won't borrow millions against stock portfolios, but the underlying lesson still applies on a smaller level. Assets behave differently than income. A paycheck is powerful, but it's temporary. Assets, if chosen carefully, can work quietly for decades. They don't require a clock-in time, they don't ask for overtime, they just grow. And the moment someone begins shifting their financial focus from purely earning to gradually owning, the long-term picture starts to look different. This doesn't happen overnight. For most people, the journey begins with small things, saving consistently, building an emergency cushion so life's surprises don't derail everything, investing in broad markets over long periods, maybe buying a small piece of ownership in businesses through index funds. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just steady progress. And over time, those small pieces of ownership begin doing something remarkable. They grow even when you're not actively working, which slowly changes your relationship with money. The goal stops being just the next paycheck. Instead, it becomes building a system that quietly supports your future self. Now, does that mean everyone can replicate the exact strategies used by the ultra-wealthy? Not really. Those strategies exist at a different scale of resources and access, but understanding them still matters because it helps explain something that often confuses people: why income alone rarely creates lasting wealth. Income can build stability. It can create security, but ownership is usually what builds long-term freedom. And once you see that difference clearly, your decisions start to shift. You might think a little more carefully about the things you buy, the debt you take on, the investments you hold, the timeline you're willing to wait. Not out of pressure, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because money, at its core, isn't just math. It's behavior, it's patience, it's psychology. It's the quiet choices people repeat year after year. And sometimes the most powerful shift isn't discovering a secret strategy. It's simply realizing that the game itself is different than we were originally taught. Most of us were trained to focus on earning, but the world of wealth often revolves around owning. And once that idea settles in, the path forward becomes a little clearer. You don't need billions. You don't need complicated strategies. You just need time, consistency, and a gradual shift in perspective. Because in a world where prices keep rising and life keeps moving, standing still financially can feel like falling behind. But the good news is, you don't have to sprint. You don't need perfect timing. You just need progress. A little ownership today, a little patience tomorrow. And over time, those quiet decisions begin to compound into something meaningful. Not overnight wealth, but something more stable, more durable, a financial life that slowly moves from constant effort toward quiet support. And in the end, that's really the deeper lesson behind understanding something like buy, borrow, die. It's not about copying the ultra-rich. It's about seeing the system clearly, so you can start making calmer, smarter decisions inside it, one step at a time. Because when it comes to money, progress almost always beats perfection.
If this video resonated with you, the next one goes even deeper. Click the video on your screen now. You don't want to miss it.